The suspicious package under the bridge looked exactly like an IED. Police had cordoned off 6 blocks. Bomb squad was 40 minutes away, and traffic was backing up for miles. But when Frank saw the device, something in his expression changed. He'd seen that exact wire pattern before, in Kandahar, attached to a roadside bomb that had killed 3 of his buddies. "Nobody move," he said quietly. "I know who made this, and I know how to stop it. Welcome to Forgotten Voices." Before we dive into this powerful tale of hidden war experience and unexpected heroism, tell me in the comments what city you're watching from today, and if you believe stories like this deserve to be told. Hit that subscribe button and help us honor the veterans who protect us in ways we never see. Frank Kowalski had been working construction in Hartford, Connecticut for 8 years, 4 months, and 12 days. Not that he was counting, but precision had become a habit during his 3 tours in Afghanistan. And habits learned in war zones didn't disappear just because the war ended. He specialized in bridge work inspection, repair, and maintenance of the aging infrastructure that kept New England traffic flowing across rivers, valleys, and railroad tracks. It was honest work that required physical strength, technical knowledge, and attention to detail. More importantly, it was work that built things instead of destroying them, which mattered to someone who'd spent 6 years of his life learning how to blow things up. Frank's crew knew him as the quiet guy who showed up early, worked hard, and never complained about overtime or dangerous assignments. He had steady hands, an eye for structural problems that other workers missed, and an almost supernatural ability to assess how much stress old steel and concrete could handle before failing. What they didn't know was that Frank's expertise with structural engineering had been earned in places where getting the calculations wrong meant people died, where understanding how buildings and bridges failed wasn't academic theory, but life or death necessity. Frank lived alone in a small apartment near the construction yard, drove a 10-year-old pickup truck that he maintained meticulously, and spent his free time reading technical manuals and watching baseball games. He'd tried dating, but civilian relationships were complicated when you woke up at 3 a.m. scanning for threats that weren't there, when loud noises made you hit the ground before your brain had time to process what you'd heard. The work was therapeutic, in ways that the VA counselors had never quite understood. 8 hours a day of physical labor, solving problems that had clear solutions, building infrastructure that would serve communities for decades. It was the opposite of everything he'd done in Afghanistan, where the primary job had been precise, necessary destruction, but destruction nonetheless. Frank had been a combat engineer with the Army Corps of Engineers, specializing in explosive ordnance, disposal, and controlled demolitions. 3 tours between 2009 and 2015. Mostly in Helmand Province and around Kandahar, clearing IEDs from roads that American convoys needed to use, destroying bridges and buildings that provided cover for Taliban fighters, and occasionally rebuilding infrastructure that civilian populations needed to survive. He'd been good at the work, maybe too good. His unit had developed a reputation for handling the assignments that other teams couldn't manage. The complex demolitions that required mathematical precision and nerves that didn't shake under pressure. Frank had learned to read explosive devices like other people read books, understanding not just how they worked, but who had made them, what materials they'd used, and what kind of tactical thinking had guided their construction. But expertise came with costs. Frank had lost 7 teammates to IEDs during his deployments, including his best friend Martinez, who'd been killed by a device that Frank had cleared the day before, thought he'd cleared. The memory of that mistake, of the explosion that could have been prevented if he'd been more careful, more thorough, more precise, still woke him up most nights. When Frank returned to civilian life in 2015, he'd tried several different jobs before settling on construction work. Office jobs made him claustrophobic. Indoor work left him restless and irritable. But construction, especially bridge work, gave him the combination of technical challenges, physical activity, and outdoor environment that helped keep the memories manageable. His supervisor, Tommy Rodriguez, had hired Frank based on work ethic and technical competence, but over 8 years, Frank had become the crew's go-to specialist for any job that required precision, patience, or working with materials that might be unstable. Tommy didn't ask questions about Frank's background beyond standard employment verification, and Frank didn't volunteer information about where he'd learned to assess structural integrity under pressure. The arrangement worked well for everyone involved. Frank got steady work that kept his mind occupied and his hands busy. The crew got a reliable specialist who could handle the jobs that made other workers nervous. The state got bridge maintenance work that was completed ahead of schedule and under budget. But 8 years of peaceful construction work hadn't erased the training that had kept Frank alive in Afghanistan. He still automatically scanned work sites for potential threats. He still positioned himself with clear escape routes when working under bridges or in confined spaces. He still carried himself with the alert awareness of someone who'd learned that complacency could be fatal. Most importantly, Frank still recognized the signatures of explosive devices that had been designed to kill Americans. Tuesday morning, October 23rd, started like any other workday for Frank's crew. They were scheduled to inspect the Rainbow Bridge, a 1940s-era steel truss structure that carried route to across the Connecticut River between Hartford and East Hartford. Routine maintenance work, checking for stress fractures, updating safety assessments, and documenting any structural changes that might affect load capacity. Frank arrived at the job site at 6:45 a.m., 15 minutes before the official start time, and began setting up equipment for the day's inspections. The Rainbow Bridge was a familiar location. He'd worked on it 4 times over the past 8 years, knew its stress points and structural quirks better than most engineers who'd designed similar bridges. At 8:23 a.m., Frank was working underneath the bridge's main span, using ultrasonic equipment to test weld integrity, when he noticed something that didn't belong. Attached to one of the primary support beams, approximately 12 feet above the waterline, was a small package wrapped in what appeared to be weatherproof material. Frank's first thought was that someone had left equipment or supplies from a previous maintenance project, but as he climbed closer to examine the package, details began registering that triggered alarm. Systems in his brain that had been developed during 3 tours in Afghanistan. The package was approximately 8 inches long, 4 inches wide, and 3 inches thick. It was attached to the beam with wire that showed signs of careful placement rather than casual attachment. The wrapping material appeared to be designed for protection against moisture and temperature changes. Most concerning, Frank could see what appeared to be electronic components through a small gap in the waterproof covering. Frank stopped moving and began the kind of systematic threat assessment that had been drilled into him during explosive ordnance disposal training. Position of the device relative to structural supports, potential blast radius, escape routes, civilian population density, time factors. The device was positioned exactly where it would cause maximum structural damage to the bridge if detonated. The electronic components suggested timer or remote activation capability. The careful concealment indicated sophisticated planning rather than casual vandalism. Frank activated his radio and called his supervisor. "Tommy, I need you to stop traffic on both sides of the bridge right now." "What's the problem?" "I found something attached to the main support beam, something that doesn't belong here." Tommy's voice carried the weight of 8 years of trusting Frank's judgment. "How serious?" Frank looked at the device again, processing details that confirmed his worst assessment. "Serious enough that you need to call police and evacuate everyone within 6 blocks and tell them to request the bomb squad." 20 minutes later, the Rainbow Bridge had been closed to traffic. Police had established a perimeter extending 6 blocks in every direction, and Frank was standing with Detective Maria Santos, trying to explain why a construction worker was qualified to identify potential explosive devices. "You're sure it's a bomb?" Detective Santos asked. Frank looked up at the device, which was clearly visible from their position under the bridge. The wire placement, the position relative to structural supports, the electronic components, everything about it suggests an improvised explosive device designed to bring down this bridge. "How do you know what IEDs look like?" Frank had been dreading this question for 8 years. "Because I spent 3 tours in Afghanistan learning to recognize and disable them." Detective Santos studied Frank with new attention. Military background, Army, Corps of Engineers, combat engineer, explosive ordnance disposal specialist. When 2009 to 2015, 3 deployments, mostly Helmand Province and Kandahar. Detective Santos was quiet for a moment, processing this information while looking between Frank and the suspicious device. "The bomb squad is 40 minutes away. Traffic is backing up for miles. Can you tell us anything else about what we're dealing with?" Frank examined the device again, this time allowing his military training to fully engage with what he was observing. Based on the wire pattern and component placement, this looks exactly like Taliban IED construction, specifically the type made by bomb makers who learned their techniques during the Soviet occupation. You can tell that just by looking at it. Seen hundreds of these devices. Different makers have signatures, preferred materials, assembly techniques, trigger mechanisms. This one matches patterns I encountered in Afghanistan. Detective Santos made a decision. What do you recommend? Frank's answer came from 6 years of experience with life or death situations, where getting it wrong meant people didn't come home. Clear the area to at least 8 blocks. Get structural engineers to assess evacuation zones for buildings that might be affected if the bridge comes down. And when the bomb squad arrives, tell them they're dealing with someone who knows how to build sophisticated devices. Can you help them? Frank looked at the device one more time, remembering other bombs, other bridges, other moments when his expertise had meant the difference between success and catastrophe. Yeah, I can help them. As Frank waited for the bomb squad to arrive, standing under a Connecticut bridge on a peaceful October morning, his mind kept slipping back to a day in Afghanistan that had changed everything he understood about the cost of making mistakes with explosive devices. March 15, 2013, Forward Operating Base, Shank, Logar Province. Frank and his team had been called to clear a bridge that intelligence suggested had been rigged with explosives by Taliban fighters retreating from an American advance. Standard procedure approach: carefully assess the threat, disable or destroy the device, secure the crossing. Frank had found the IED exactly where intelligence had predicted, attached to the main support structure in a position calculated to drop the entire bridge into the river below. The device was sophisticated: multiple charges, redundant trigger mechanisms, anti-tamper features designed to kill anyone who tried to disable it. But Frank had been confident in his abilities. 3 years of training, dozens of successful disposals, a reputation for handling the devices that made other specialists nervous. He'd assessed the bomb, identified what he believed were all its components, and systematically disabled what he thought were all its trigger mechanisms. The bridge had been declared safe. American forces had crossed it. Frank's team had moved on to the next assignment. 18 hours later, Martinez and 2 other soldiers had been crossing the same bridge when a secondary device, one that Frank had missed, had detonated, dropping them into the river along with 20 feet of steel and concrete. Martinez had survived the explosion but drowned before rescue teams could reach him. Frank had made a mistake. Not a careless mistake, not a lazy mistake, but a mistake born of overconfidence in his own expertise. He'd assumed he understood the bomb maker's techniques, had failed to account for the possibility of backup systems he hadn't encountered before. 3 good soldiers had died because Frank thought he knew everything about explosive devices, when the truth was that every bomb was different. Every bomb maker had techniques that might be new. Every disposal operation carried risks that couldn't be eliminated through expertise alone. The memory of that failure had haunted Frank through his remaining 2 years in Afghanistan and 8 years of civilian life. It was why he'd chosen construction work over higher-paying technical jobs, because building things felt like penance for a career spent destroying them. It was why he'd never married, never started a family, because he'd proven that his judgment could fail when people depended on him. But now, standing under the Rainbow Bridge, Frank realized that his experience with failure might be exactly what was needed to prevent another tragedy. Detective Santos approached with news that the bomb squad was 30 minutes away. Frank, can you tell us anything else about what we're dealing with? Frank forced himself to focus on the present rather than memories of Afghanistan. The device looks stable now. Immediate trigger mechanisms visible, probably timer or remote activated. But I need to warn the bomb squad about something. What? Whoever made this device is sophisticated. The construction techniques, the placement, the concealment. This isn't someone who learned bomb making from internet videos. This is someone with professional training, possibly military or intelligence background, which means Frank's answer came from hard-earned experience with underestimating opponents, which means there might be backup systems, secondary devices, or anti-tamper mechanisms that aren't immediately visible. The bomb squad needs to approach this, assuming the maker anticipated professional disposal techniques. Detective Santos was taking notes. Anything else? Frank looked at the bridge, processing. tactical considerations that had become second nature during his military service. If this device is designed to bring down the bridge, and it's sophisticated enough to suggest professional construction, then the maker probably has escape and observation plans. They might be watching to see how we respond. You think they're nearby. I think someone smart enough to build a device this sophisticated is smart enough to want to know whether their plan worked. Detective Santos activated her radio and began coordinating expanded perimeter security and surveillance of potential observation positions. As she worked, Frank continued studying the device, using skills he'd hoped never to need again. The bomb was definitely sophisticated. The wire patterns matched Taliban construction techniques, but the electronic components looked more advanced than typical insurgent devices. The positioning was perfect for maximum structural damage. Most concerning, Frank could see what appeared to be multiple trigger systems, suggesting redundancy designed to prevent disposal. Frank made a decision that surprised him. For 8 years, he'd avoided any situation that might require him to use his military training. He'd chosen civilian work specifically to escape the kind of life or death decisions that had cost Martinez his life. But now, looking at a device designed to kill innocent people, Frank realized that running away from his past hadn't made him safer, had just delayed the moment when he'd have to decide whether his experience was worth the risk of making another mistake. When the bomb squad arrived, Frank would volunteer to help, not because he was confident in his abilities, but because his experience with failure might help them avoid the kind of overconfidence that had killed his best friend. The Hartford Police Department's bomb squad consisted of 3 specialists with extensive training in explosive device disposal, but their experience was primarily with domestic situations, suspicious packages, abandoned backpacks, devices constructed by amateurs using commercially available materials. When Sergeant Michael Chen arrived at the Rainbow Bridge and examined the device through binoculars, he immediately recognized that this was beyond typical civilian bomb threats. "This is military-grade construction," he told Detective Santos. "We're going to need federal backup ATF, FBI, possibly military EOD specialists. How long will that take?" "Minimum 2 hours, probably longer." Detective Santos looked at the growing traffic backup, the thousands of commuters affected by bridge closure, and the potential for panic if word spread about a sophisticated bomb in downtown Hartford. "What about your construction worker, the one with military experience?" Sergeant Chen had been briefed about Frank's background, but was hesitant to involve civilians in bomb disposal operations. "He's not certified for current procedures. Military EOD training is different from civilian bomb squad protocols. But he's seen devices like this before." Apparently, Detective Santos made a command decision. At least get his assessment. If he can provide intelligence that helps federal specialists when they arrive, that's valuable. If he can identify specific threats that help you secure the scene, that's even better. Sergeant Chen approached Frank with the caution of someone who'd learned to be suspicious of unofficial expertise. "I understand you have EOD experience. 3 tours in Afghanistan, specialized in IED disposal and controlled demolitions. What can you tell me about this device?" Frank had been studying the bomb for over an hour, and his assessment had become increasingly concerning. The construction matches Taliban techniques, but the electronic components are more sophisticated than typical insurgent devices. The placement is designed for maximum structural damage. Most importantly, I can see at least 2 different trigger systems. Multiple triggers. Redundancy. If someone disables the primary system, the backup activates. It's a technique used against American EOD teams design the bomb to kill the person trying to disarm it. Sergeant Chen understood the implications. "What do you recommend?" Frank's answer came from experience with devices designed by people who understood American disposal techniques. Don't approach it like a standard civilian bomb. Assume the maker anticipated professional disposal procedures. Look for devices, secondary charges, and remote observation capabilities. Can you identify specific threats? Frank hesitated. 8 years of civilian life had been built around avoiding exactly this kind of situation, high stakes. Life or death decisions, responsibility for other people's safety. But the alternative was allowing less experienced specialists to approach a device that might kill them. "I can try, but I need you to understand something. In Afghanistan, I made a mistake that got 3 soldiers killed. I'm not infallible. Sergeant Chen appreciated Frank's honesty about his limitations. What kind of mistake? I thought I understood a bomb maker's techniques better than I actually did. I missed a secondary device that killed my team members after I'd declared the area safe. But you learned from that mistake. Frank nodded. I learned that every device is different. Every bomb maker has techniques you might not have seen before, and overconfidence kills people. Sergeant Chen made his decision. Will you help us assess this device? Not as primary disposal specialist, but as consultant on Taliban construction techniques. Frank looked up at the bomb, then at the bridge filled with commuters who would return as soon as the device was neutralized. Then at the specialists who would risk their lives to protect those civilians. Yeah, I'll help. For the next 90 minutes, Frank worked with the bomb squad to develop a comprehensive assessment of the device and disposal strategy. Using binoculars, cameras, and remote observation equipment, they identified multiple components that confirmed Frank's initial assessment. The bomb was sophisticated, professionally constructed, and designed with anti-tamper features specifically intended to kill disposal specialists. But Frank's experience with similar devices allowed the team to identify threats that might have been missed by specialists unfamiliar with Taliban construction techniques. When federal EOD specialists arrived from the nearby Air Force Base, they found a detailed assessment that allowed them to approach the device with complete understanding of its construction, trigger mechanisms, and potential hazards. The disposal operation took 4 hours and required techniques that only military specialists with Afghanistan experience could have managed safely. But because Frank had provided accurate intelligence about the device's construction, the federal team was able to neutralize all trigger systems without incident. The Rainbow Bridge was reopened to traffic at 6:47 p.m., 12 hours after Frank had first noticed the suspicious package. No one was injured. The device was safely removed for analysis. The bomb maker was never identified, but forensic analysis confirmed that the device had been constructed by someone with professional military or intelligence training. In the weeks following the Rainbow Bridge incident, Frank's life changed in ways he hadn't expected. The Hartford Police Department, Connecticut State Police, and federal agencies had all documented his contributions to preventing what could have been a catastrophic terrorist attack. Detective Santos recommended Frank for a civilian commendation that recognized his role in protecting public safety. Sergeant Chen wrote an official report that credited Frank's expertise with providing intelligence that had been essential for safe disposal of the device. The federal IOD team leader sent a letter to Frank's supervisor commending his technical knowledge and professional cooperation. But the recognition that mattered most to Frank came from an unexpected source. 3 weeks after the incident, Frank received a phone call from Master Sergeant David Martinez, the younger brother of the friend he'd lost in Afghanistan. David had heard about the Rainbow Bridge situation through military networks and wanted to thank Frank for using his experience to protect civilians. Miguel always said you were the best EOD specialist he'd ever worked with, David told Frank. During their conversation, he would have been proud of what you did in Hartford. Frank had spent 8 years carrying guilt about Martinez's death, believing that his mistake had dishonored his friend's memory. But David's words offered a different perspective, that using his experience to save lives was the best way to honor the sacrifice of soldiers who'd been killed by the devices Frank had learned to understand. Your brother was a good soldier and a better friend, Frank replied. I wish I could have brought him home. You did bring him home, David said, and now you're using what he helped teach you to bring other people home safely. That's exactly what he would have wanted. The conversation helped Frank understand something that 8 years of civilian life hadn't taught him, that his military experience, including his failures, could be valuable for protecting people rather than just a source of guilt and trauma. Frank continued working construction, but he also began volunteering with local emergency services, providing consultation on suspicious devices and training for first responders who might encounter improvised explosives. His expertise was documented with state and federal agencies, making him a resource for situations that required knowledge of military-grade explosive devices. Most importantly, Frank began talking to other veterans about the challenges of transitioning military skills to civilian purposes. His experience on the Rainbow Bridge had demonstrated that expertise gained in war zones could be redirected toward protecting communities rather than destroying them. Frank never sought publicity for his role in the incident. He declined interviews, avoided media attention, and continued living quietly in his small apartment near the construction yard. But his reputation within law enforcement and emergency response communities grew as word spread about the construction worker who'd helped prevent a terrorist attack. 6 months after the Rainbow Bridge incident, Frank was contacted by the FBI's Joint Terrorism Task Force and asked to provide consultation on other suspicious devices found in the region. His assessments had proven accurate, his recommendations had enhanced disposal operations, and his willingness to share knowledge without seeking recognition had earned respect from federal specialists. "You found a way to use your military experience to serve your community," Detective Santos told Frank during one of their regular check-ins. "That's something to be proud of." Frank looked out at the Rainbow Bridge, where traffic flowed normally, across a structure that could have been destroyed if his experience hadn't been available when it was needed. "I spent a lot of years thinking my military training was just baggage from a war I wanted to forget," he replied. "Turns out it was preparation for protecting the place I wanted to call home." 2 years after the Rainbow Bridge incident, Frank Kowalski was still working construction in Hartford, still living quietly, still building infrastructure that would serve communities for decades. But his role had evolved beyond routine bridge maintenance. Frank had become the go-to consultant for any construction project that involved potential explosive hazards, renovation of old buildings that might contain unexploded ordnance, infrastructure work near former military installations, and emergency response situations that required expertise with dangerous materials. His reputation had spread through professional networks to the point where other veterans with similar backgrounds began reaching out for advice on translating military skills to civilian careers. Frank discovered that many former combat engineers, EOD specialists, and demolitions experts were struggling with the same questions he'd faced: how to use destructive knowledge for constructive purposes. Frank began mentoring other veterans, helping them find construction and emergency response jobs where their military expertise could be valuable without being traumatic. He developed training programs that taught civilian first responders to recognize military-grade explosive devices. He consulted with federal agencies on threat assessment protocols that incorporated lessons learned from overseas combat operations. But Frank's most important work remained the most visible: building and maintaining the bridges, roads, and infrastructure that connected communities and enabled economic development. Every day, thousands of people crossed structures that Frank had helped design, repair, or secure, usually without knowing that their safety depended partly on expertise gained in a war zone. Halfway around the world, Frank had learned that the most effective way to honor fallen comrades wasn't to forget the skills that had failed to save them, but to use those skills to protect others in their memory. His experience with failure had taught him humility that made him more effective, not less. His knowledge of destruction had given him insight into construction that civilian engineers couldn't replicate. "Some days I build bridges," Frank told a group of veteran trainees during one of his mentorship sessions. "Some days I protect them. Most days I do both. And I've learned that the skills we developed in war zones aren't our burden to carry. They're our contribution to the communities we're protecting." The Rainbow Bridge continued to carry traffic across the Connecticut River, its steel structure maintained by workers who understood that their job was about more than engineering specifications and safety regulations. They were building the infrastructure that allowed communities to function, connecting people and places in ways that made economic and social life possible. And sometimes, when threats emerged that could have destroyed that infrastructure, the same hands that had learned destruction in Afghanistan were there to provide protection, using hard-earned expertise to ensure that bridges built communities rather than becoming barriers that divided them. Frank had found peace not by forgetting his military experience, but by transforming it into something that served the country he'd fought to protect: one bridge, one road, one safe crossing at a time.